Good evening, everyone. My name is Ben Kelly from The Independent, and we're here tonight to talk about 50 years since Stonewall, 50 years of Pride, and what that means for us today in 2019. I'm going to introduce these lovely guests on the sofa with me in just a second, but first of all, there's a little bit of a video introduction to look at how far we've come over the years. It's been 50 years since the Stonewall riots erupted in June 1969 in New York, after members of the LGBT community decided to fight back against oppression and violence from the city's police. Stonewall was commemorated a year later in a march through New York, which is now recognized as the very first gay pride parade. The idea quickly spread around the US and internationally, with 1972 seeing the first pride parade in London. Across the past half-century, the LGBT community has made huge strides towards equality in countries and continents around the world, but too many are still left behind in societies where homosexuality can be punished by prison or even death. Today, pride parades have grown into enormous events, with almost 1 million people on the streets of London last year, and they've become more diverse as our community has developed a rightful appreciation of the various identities encompassed by our colourful rainbow flag. Pride is still led by LGBT and campaign groups, but also includes high street names and corporations and institutions like the NHS and the Met Police, reflecting the various areas of public life in which our community contributes. While we've made great progress on LGBT rights in the UK, there are still parents fighting to deny the very existence of gay people to their children. The transgender community faces continuing assaults from sections of the media and society. And in Northern Ireland, same-sex marriage remains illegal. What do we want? Equal marriage! What do we want it? No! Elsewhere in the world, people are risking everything to bravely show pride on the streets of far more hostile countries, such as the march in Kiev, Ukraine in June, their largest one yet. 50 years on from Stonewall, it's important to remember that while many of us can enjoy Pride as a party, in essence, it will always be a protest. So, with all that considered, the main question tonight is, what does Pride mean in 2019? And we've got some great people here who are going to shed some answers for that. It's my pleasure to introduce, on behalf of The Independent, Peter Tatchell, veteran human rights campaigner who has been championing LGBT plus rights for 50 years. Angela Eagle, the Labour MP for Wallasey, first elected in 1997. She is
92.
92.
And I too am a veteran.
Oh. And only the second lesbian MP to sit in the House of Commons. That's correct?
Yes.
Crispin Blunt is the Conservative MP for Reigate and the Secretary of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Global LGBT plus Rights.
New boy, elected 97.
97, there we go, yeah. Amateur. And Asifa Lahore is Britain's first out Muslim drag queen whose work and activism is challenging stereotypes around transgender issues and what it means to be LGBT plus and Muslim. She's got a new single out.
Yes, I've recorded the official Croydon Pride single this year.
It's called Who I Am. There you go. So the first part of the discussion is really looking back at Stonewall, 50 years since June 1969, on that night when the patrons of the Stonewall Inn in New York City fought back against police oppression and said no more. Really the night that, I suppose, the LGBT community came out of the closet and fought back. And I just wanted to start off and say, looking back 50 years, Peter, I'll start with you actually. What does the Stonewall riots and the beginning mean to you when you look back at it?
Well, first of all, I'd like to pay tribute to the preceding LGBT plus movement, the Homosexual Law Reform Society and the Northwest Campaign for Homosexual Law Reform, which championed, prior to Stonewall, the partial decriminalisation of 1967. And I think we should remember they were operating in a much more difficult period. But nevertheless, they did so largely as closeted LGBT plus people, whereas the big significant fact of the Stonewall uprising was the birth of the Gay Liberation Front, which was the first time that literally thousands of LGBT plus people came out, declared their sexuality and demanded rights. rights beyond law reform to also include challenges to the church, the media, the education system. It was a much broader agenda. And also, interestingly, the word equality never passed our lips. We were not interested in equal rights within an unjust, flawed society. We want to change society. So we allied with the women's liberation movement, the black liberation movement, workers' organizations to try and build a coalition for social transformation. And I think that that agenda of social transformation is what has been lost in the intervening 50 years. I think we've now lowered our horizons to the much more limited agenda of equal rights and really forgotten the radical vision of the Stonewall generation, which was about changing society.
Do you agree with that, Angela? You can applaud it first, yeah.
It's clear that liberation and transforming society is what that movement was about. And as Peter pointed out, it was part of a wider movement in that era to transform society, women's liberation being part of that across the entire agenda, not just formally in law, although that was very important. The suffragettes knew that thought that if you changed the law then everything else would follow. And of course what the liberation movements in the 60s realised was that you actually had to be much more upfront and live your change rather than just have the formal equality. And I think that the radicalisation that happened in the 60s then went sort of back into abeyance as we went particularly into the sort of loads of money 80s and all of that. And these things tend to go in political eras. And as we became a more individualistic society under Mrs. Thatcher, I think a lot of that social justice transformation agenda, which many of us on the left of progressive politics yearned to come back, was kind of lost. And I'd certainly, for one, would be right at the forefront of trying to get it back again.
Crispin, what does pride mean to you?
Well, obviously, I thank God you achieved the good bit and not the bad bit of the agenda, because we now live in a society where equality is completely embedded into the establishment. That means a huge amount for someone like me, as a son of a soldier. Both my grandfathers were soldiers, so I kind of epitomise establishment England in many ways. My background, and though I would point to two grandfathers coming from very different social backgrounds in my past to say that I'm not if you like, a classic public school Tory except superficially. And I think that had the wider, almost revolutionary agenda about changing society completely would have come at a horrendous price that we've seen in societies that have tried that scale of transformation. And though I think is utterly wonderful about the radicalism that then informed the gay liberation movement and the rest, is that in the end, you were the people doing the hard yards that created the space for people like me to be able to come to terms with myself, and then to be able to come out, and actually for it to be seen when I came out as a government minister in 2010, because I was under a certain amount of pressure from the Daily Mail about the conduct of prisons policy at the time, because I was seen as a liberalising force as a new prisons minister, that I was obviously doing this in order to protect my job, because now it's going to be impossible to sack me. So we'd got to, and so society had so completely changed in respect of all the equality issues. We've now woken up properly to the trans issue, and now there's a really very proper debate about how we deal with the details. But just think how different it now is. I mean, it's the biggest thing in my life to be able to when I came out, and I wasn't brave enough. I didn't understand myself enough because of the way society was constructed. As a child born in 1960, coming from a very conventional family, I didn't know myself. I didn't understand why these things called girls were just quite difficult, but I just knew the alternative was criminal in the profession I wanted to go into, which was the army. And there were no other points of contact. And so I don't think, although if your politics are therefore about total societal transformation, because I can recognise the kind of the disappointment that we didn't get that. I'm from the other side of politics. I think, thank God, we had the 1980s to liberate entrepreneurial Britain to actually be the economic success that we now are. Now that's where the divide is. The divide is between us, but on equality, we've now completely captured the establishment to such an extent. I have to tell you that there's only one person sitting up here who was invited by the Prime Minister to her LGBT reception last night, and that was Peter.
What is that about?
We're all sending separate complaints, so if anyone wants to sign the petition. Asifa, when you look back at Stonewall, we've been commemorating, haven't we, in the press and the media and all the Pride events. What does it mean for you?
For me, what it means is simply representing every single colour in the rainbow and beyond. And what I mean by that, I mean, as the only person of colour on this panel today, I actually feel a bit of pressure, and I feel that, again, we're totally missing the point that actually it was a trans woman of colour who threw the first stone at the Stonewall riots.
Dead right.
And that's what it's about for me. It's about simply actually representing everyone, the diversity of the LGBT community, because I feel that we are the most diverse community in Britain today, and indeed around the world. And, you know, I deal with people from my own British, Pakistani and Asian community that happen to be LGBT and queer, and may not even identify with those labels. I mean, now we have a younger generation that identify as non-binary, as trans, as, you know, homogenous, whatever you want to call it. And I guess I'm just here because I want to represent everyone in the country that doesn't get a voice, doesn't feel their voice is heard, and always feel that their issues are brushed underneath the carpet. And I can talk about something that's happening today that in a way has impacted my life. So I am a child of the 90s. I grew up at a time when Section 28 was in place. The first time I came across the word gay was actually in the school playground when I was bullied for being gay. I didn't know what being gay was. Coming from a Pakistani background where actually it's legal to be transgender, we have the third gender in my heritage country of Pakistan enshrined in law. Spending some teenage years in Pakistan and then coming to the UK to get severely bullied as being gay, and not knowing what that was and taking on that pressure actually led to me not coming out as transgender for many years. It led to me not being able to sort of reconcile parts of my identity, including my faith and my gender identity and my sexuality. And if we look now, for example, the debate around LGBT education, around the no outsiders protests that are happening up and down the country, in Birmingham in particular, I think back to my experiences of education during Section 28, and the fact that if we don't use our voices in very much a different way to how we have been using them so far the last 50 years, is not to forget our history, because just as quickly as laws and rights are brought into law, they can be taken away at any time. And I guess I'm here just to remind everyone, hey, there's still lots of work to be done.
Yeah.
There is quite a lot of, I think there is a lot of satisfaction, obviously, and a little bit of complacency about the distance that we've come in the last 30 years. Which anyone who contemplates what's been going on in Birmingham and some of the shadowy organisations behind it, and how they're trying to start culture war and set Muslims against LGBT people, white teachers against pupils and Asian communities, in order to try to roll back the gains that we've made. I think it's not a surprise that they are aiming at schools, because schools are only just recovering from the terrible legacy of Section 28. Stonewall and various other organisations have been doing great work. The National Union of Teachers have been doing great work about dealing with bullying in schools, but there's still a bit of a reluctance, which is a legacy of Section 28. And that is where we solve it. If you talk to kids, they're completely inclusive. They're completely open to difference. It's only when adults start telling them that it's somehow wrong and threatening that we get back to the kind of bigotry that many of us in this room will have experienced when we were growing up and campaigning.
And we are going to come on to talk about the Birmingham issue in detail a bit later, and we're going to speak a little bit more about this issue before we take some questions. I see some hands. We will come to that.
Could I just respond to Asifa?
Yeah, of course.
We all recognise that our history has been suppressed, and we're trying to resurrect that history and to tell the truth. So it's very important when we tell our own histories that we tell the truth. And sadly, there is now the myth that trans people began and led the Stonewall uprising. I'm sorry to say that is not true. There were trans people there, but all the evidence shows that the first person to resist the police and to provoke the riot was a white lesbian who was being taken by the police, who called out to the crowd, "What are you doing standing there? Do something." She ignited that, and then a Latino gay man responded by fighting the police. And then trans people did join in. But the two trans people who are often cited with involvement in Stonewall, both of them interviewed, have admitted they were not there on that night, certainly not at the beginning. They came later, that's true. So I think, we must recognise that trans people were part of this protest, but we mustn't exaggerate, because then if we exaggerate, we destroy our own integrity. We destroy and rewrite our own history in a way which is not honest and truthful and which damages us. So let's acknowledge that trans people were there, but let's not perpetuate these myths. And let's, of course, support the trans community in their battles, but not rewrite history to suit a convenient political agenda of right now. And can I just recommend that for any of you who want to read the most authoritative history of the Stonewall Uprising, the book by David Carter is the book to read. It is the most authoritative book ever written. He interviewed hundreds of people who were there, and he's distilled all the evidence. He went to all these various people and said, "Oh, you remember that night and so-and-so did so-and-so." He made up stories, and anybody who agreed with his concoctions was instantly dismissed as not being credible. So he was left with people who only said, "No, that's not true, I didn't see that person, that didn't happen." And I think, his account is really a fantastic account. It does profile trans people who were there later on that night, early in the morning and the next day and so on, but he does put things in perspective.
So if we do all considered, and obviously the movement over those few days and the riots did include all sorts of sexualities, genders, people of colour, etc., the speed at which those different groups have achieved equality has been very different over the years, and that's kind of what you touched on at the beginning.
Yeah.
Some people will say, well, I'm a gay man, I've largely got equality now, that's it sorted. It's important, isn't it not, that we remain under one banner and take it all forward together. Would you agree?
Well, I've just spoken a bit, so I think someone else should have a chance to speak.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, I'll put it to you, Crispin. When we march for Pride, do we have a duty to bring along the sections of our community who are not enjoying the kind of rights and privileges that some of the others?
No, of course we do. And there are obviously issues to address in schools. There are issues about trans people. But put that in the context of what's happening elsewhere in the world. And I know we're going to come on to the global dimension of this. But there are, and let's remember that Stonewall was in 1969. This goes through history. And if you take kind of Britain's modern history as being from the end of the Second World War, in the 1950s, you had a British Home Secretary aggressively locking gay men up. So there were over 1,000 gay men in custody for a consensual act between them. Now, there has been a sea change, of which Wolfenden obviously is the important precursor, leading to the legislation in 1967 in the UK, obviously then Stonewall riots in 1969 in the States. And so the liberal West has managed this movement. But if you look, what was the most important event perhaps in the last decade in this area? Probably the decision of the Indian Supreme Court to finally get to a place. 100 million of us benefited from that change in the law in India. And so, whilst, sure, we focus on the UK, and a lot of the laws of all the Commonwealth countries are a product of the Victorian era anti-sodomy laws that they just simply left in their constitutions when the British Empire came to an end. And so we do owe a special debt to try and assist the LGBT activists in those countries, help reverse those laws. But we, from the privileged position, relatively privileged position, might not be entirely sorted yet, and there is, quite agree, no room for complacency. But in other parts of the world, there are people fighting those battles that we're fighting here in the 1950s, only more so. They're not just going to prison, they're being killed as a consequence.
And Asifa, if I could ask you, do you feel that the Pride movement today, the transgender movement is behind in terms of the stigma that they face and the way that they're accepted, but do you feel like there's a turning point happening at the moment, that they're being brought back into the fore, that the people, for example, in the gay or lesbian community are saying, come along, we'll bring you forward, or is still not enough being done?
I think there's a mixture of things happening. I think definitely the spotlight very much is on the transgender community, especially in the last few years. And a lot of it has actually been, I feel, propelled a lot by the younger generations, because they're the ones that are talking very much about gender identity. You know, schools and pupils at schools are now talking about gender being fluid, being concept, etc. You know, charities like Stonewall. I mean, Ruth Hunt has done some amazing work for Stonewall. Can we? Yeah, I just want to shout out to Ruth, because she's really taken something where she's put trans rights really at the top of what Stonewall is currently about. And I think, look, last year's Pride Parade, what happened at the start of that Pride Parade, where, you know, a group of, can I say militant lesbians, literally said that they didn't want trans people, or, you know, there was a sort of protest sort of group at the start of it. And
well, it was a tiny group of very
sure, but it still
gay
happened,
women
right?
who had a particular view,
sure,
which is a tiny minority, but they also have a bit of a flair for publicity, I think. That
sure,
but it speaks to some of that conflict, doesn't it?
It speaks to some of that conflict, and also, I mean, you know, there's been a lot of recent television debates. I mean, I remember one on Channel 4, Genderquake, last year, where, you know, Monroe Bergdorf was like famously heckled by feminists for, you know, for being an out trans woman, and not just that, but a trans woman of color. Mm-hmm. So yes, the spotlight definitely is on transgender people and transgender movements at the moment, but
can I say
personally,
that
I think a lot of it is negative rather than positive.
I think that the trans issue is a bit behind in terms of liberation, and we've all got to demonstrate our solidarity with trans people. But they have got to organise their own liberation with our help. We don't tell them how to do it. They've got to do it themselves. And so we have to have solidarity with them. But I think it's very unfortunate, and I suspect it's campaigning seen through the eye of social media, that you only hear the extremes, whether they're militant feminists, if you want to call them that, or militant trans people having a row. We have much more in common than that which divides us. And I think we need to show solidarity across all of those areas that have been oppressed in the past, that seek their own liberation. Because divide and rule is a very old tactic, and one of the biggest things to remember is unity is strength.
Could I just say, I was going to answer your original question you asked.
Go on.
But can I just say that I wasn't having a go at Asifa. I'm sure she said what she said in good faith, and I too believed for many years that trans people led the fight. And I said it myself. It's only more when this recent history's been uncovered that I've learned the truth. But it is so common now. I don't blame anybody if they repeat this mantra that trans people started it and led it and everything. So I'm not having a go at you because everybody you see it everywhere. This has just become the mantra of the moment. And I think all I'm just saying is we need to look at the actual history. And in terms of your original question, I can remember years ago, even back in the days of the Gay Liberation Front in the early 1970s here in London, some gay men, mostly gay men, would say, what have trans people got to do with us? It's different. Well, those of us in the Gay Liberation Front who had a solidarity with trans people used to say, well, the common thread that unites us is that we're all gender nonconformists. You know, gay men don't behave in the way of traditional masculinity. Lesbian women don't conform to traditional ideas of femininity. Trans people don't fit the gender stereotypes. And so that gender nonconformity is the thread that unites us and gives us a common interest in working together.
Yeah.
Can I say to Asifa, because as with a generational effect, that this is now different in the younger generation. So my daughter at university, a mate called Amru, who put together
Amru very well.
You know Amru, and so he put together a brilliant drag act at university, and I gave a 21st birthday party for my daughter, and explaining to my brother, who's 10 years older than me, that the guy who's tottering in on high heels into the party is actually straight, was a sort of confusion about why would a straight guy be taking part in a drag act of which some of the drag artists were gay and some were straight. And this is and there is no identity now to put over people, particularly amongst today's generation of whatever one wants to call them, millennials, all the rest.
Sure.
The final point about Pride today that I wanted to raise before we take questions from the audience is, obviously Pride is not just LGBT groups, it's Starbucks, it's HSBC, it's everybody's got Pride flags up. I was up on the top of the Heron Tower the other day and I could see rainbows on buildings all over the place that have got nothing to do with that, but that's fine. And the big question we ask it every year is Pride too corporate, Angela?
Yeah. I mean, I went to World Pride in Madrid a couple of years ago, and they actually let the trade unionists and the people that have done all the hard work march at the front. And I'm kind of fed up of us being right at the back of the march because we have to march between a gigantic blow-up model of a Deliveroo. Obviously, it's good that people and corporations feel that they can be inclusive in this area. That's fine, but we need to get the balance back, I think.
Anybody else got any points on that before we...
It's a big indicator that we've won to a very significant degree.
Yeah.
That for corporations not to be associated with this agenda is a big issue for them. And remember the help it gives us in trying to advance the position of LGBT rights activists in other parts of the world if the big multinationals headquartered in the liberal West are then a serious point of leverage for us, that they will have LGBT friendly policies in places like Kampala and elsewhere in the world, and that let's not underestimate that. And if the price is that it's a bit corporate in London, and rather better finance than it might otherwise have been, then
you'll take it.
So what?
Okay.
Can I just say that I think a lot of businesses do have a very genuine commitment to LGBT plus rights, and that's fantastic. But there are some which I think sometimes are quite tokenistic, and they seem to see, or they give the impression that they see Pride as a marketing opportunity to LGBT plus consumers. So a good example was the Marks and Spencer's LGBT sandwich. Lettuce, guacamole, bacon and tomato. It's true that M&S did make a donation to an LGBT plus charity, but I think it was only about £10,000, and they would have made much more from the sale of those sandwiches.
Really?
And that is tiny by comparison to the hundreds of millions that company turns over. So I think, when companies act in that way, I think it's not good.
So this is just an issue that the Albert Kennedy Trust weren't quite clever enough in their negotiations about getting how much they should get out of those sandwiches. I went to the Albert Kennedy Trust reception a couple of nights ago, and they were just immensely grateful that Marks and Spencer's had done that. So there's a point to be made. I think it was a genuine point. Whether the donation was appropriate enough, but they were doing it.
Okay.
And the Albert Kennedy Trust does fantastic work, and they benefited at least to some degree from it.
And when you think the cost of advertising, the publicity Marks and Spencer's got, was worth millions in terms of advertising costs.
Yeah.
So
Very quickly, and then go into the audience.
I just want to say that actually, Pride funding aside, Pride parade aside, I think there's positives in it in the sense that, I always think of the next generation of younger people, and younger people seeing the rainbow flag everywhere, seeing the trans flag everywhere. I think that sends a positive message out, because when I was younger, even 10, 15 odd years ago, we weren't seeing the rainbow flag everywhere. We weren't seeing it in our M&S, in our Sainsbury's, in our Tesco's. And to me, I think there's positives in that, because as young people see this, I hate using that word of normalizing, but it just makes it even more apparent, especially in this social media era that we're going in, that it's okay to be LGBT.
Absolutely. Now, if anyone's got a question about the history of Pride, trans inclusion, or corporate, anything we've discussed, just raise your hand and we will bring a microphone down to you. So I'm going to take this Jen first, and he's on the inside. If you could just wait till the mic comes down to you there.
Thank you very much. I listened with some interest to some of the comments by your panel. Just a couple of things. I think I have a great deal of time for Peter, but I think one of the problems I have with this approach to the trans thing that he was just bringing up and Stonewall was, it reminds me of I've been around for them, as you might be able to tell. I was on the march in 1972, which for reasons entirely unknown took us out to the far region of West London, to Shepherd's Bush Green. When we were marching there, we marched past the Coherd, where we were attacked by people from that well-known leather bar because they saw us as disturbing the status quo, and they didn't like that. They felt if we disturbed things, it would reflect adversely on them. One of the dangers within an organisation, and organisations like the gay rights people, are that very many people have really strong feelings. I think we have to be really, really careful about not turning on ourselves, because that kind of internalizing warfare can easily be destructive. And the trans issue is one of the things that is currently an issue. It can be destructive to us. It doesn't affect our enemies. We need to be very careful about that. I'm really reassured to know, quote, the establishment is now fully accepting of gay rights.
Well, Lisbon
that may well be true for the august members of the panel, but not being one of the establishment, I'm less sanguine about this particular claim. Where I live in London is actually fairly good, fairly reasonable. But I'm aware that there are some people who are really hostile to the fact that I'm a gay man.
Yeah.
And I've never been attacked, but there's the odd comments I go past.
Yeah.
But I'm well known as being able to defend myself, and I don't have a problem with that. When we move outside of areas like London, as Birmingham's been mentioned, exactly how secure does the kids in schools in Birmingham feel? The fact that the establishment is happy, great. But what about them? Where do they come into that particular?
Okay, I'm gonna. That's two questions, sir. So I'm gonna pass on to this gent over on this side, if you don't mind. Thank you very much.
Can I make one more point?
Very quickly, just a point.
The acceptance of us in a commercial environment, I have huge questions about it, and I don't ever feel really comfortable about it. But if you don't like it, the question you have to ask yourself is, what did we spend all those years marching for if it's not that kind of acceptance? What other outcomes do we expect to get?
Thank you. Thank you. Was there someone in the second row? There you are.
There was the thing about Birmingham.
Yeah.
Which is being portrayed as being anti-LGBT. I just wonder if it's more a case that No Outsiders Project is showing that people are equal, the girls have equal value to boys,
I think it's
and
the
that
lot.
people's
Isn't it?
religions, no matter which they are, have equal value. Is this not more what they're campaigning against, and that they're using the anti-LGBT as a unifying force, between various, because they know it will.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure everyone can hear you, but he was making a point about Birmingham and what you think what you think's behind it. Yeah, there you go.
Oh.
Sorry. What you say? Just say again what you really thought was.
It was the fact that the Birmingham issue has been shown as an anti-LGBT.
Yeah.
I just wonder whether some of this is the No Outsiders Project being the fact that nobody is outside, the fact that girls have equal value to boys, and the fact that different people, different religions, actually have the same value. And this is what is more upsetting to the protesters outside the schools in Birmingham.
Okay, we are going to get on to Birmingham in the next section. Does anyone have any questions before we go on to that? Because we can jump straight in if that's the case. Just one more there. Yep. That gent at the back.
Hello. I read with interest again Peter's article about the way that Pride in London seems to be more compliant with regulations determined by Westminster Council than ever before, that with restrictions on the number of individuals who can take part, it seems that the sponsors have now won our Pride March. I have been going on Pride Marches since '85, and only in recent years have we been ticketed, excluded and corralled into areas where we are considered to be monitored numbers and safe to be. Whereas in the past, if it was a Pride event, we were part of it. They say there's 1 million people on last year, but a large majority of those people were actually behind barriers. I just wanted some observations on that front.
And do you think that's more of an issue than perhaps the corporate thing we were discussing?
It is basically the balance between the corporate priorities, the floats, the things that are paid for, the things that are the money men are behind, versus those of us who actually just want to be part of something which is standing up for our own rights. I'd rather be able to join a parade, march, whatever they describe it as, than be behind a barrier just waving at a float that says Tesco's or KPMG.
Yep. Should we just go to the lady there next to the gent who answered the question before?
Thank you. Hi. I just wanted to quickly ask or display my hypothesis that back then, 50 years ago, it was the question was about adhering to gender norms, may that be female or male. And nowadays with the trans community, I think it's a lot about overcoming the gender binary. And I was just questioning how that plays into the whole discussion. Yes.
Would you like to say anything about that? Or so is the difference between overcoming gender norms 50 years ago and today it's more about breaking down the binary?
Yes, so that it's clearly a spectrum nowadays, at least for me personally, the way I got to know the whole movement in the LGBTQ and IA plus community. So it's more of a spectrum. And I feel like something that fell under the table back then, and 50 years ago, was a lot of we fight gender norms but haven't gotten to the point where we question gender binary.
I mean, look, as a trans person, everyone's transition and everyone's trans identity is so unique and individual to them. And I can't sit here and talk about the trans community as a whole because there's always discussions when it comes to the term of trans and the umbrella term of trans. Me identifying still as Britain's first out Muslim drag queen is an issue sometimes for the trans community as to why I can't drop the drag queen label and why I can't just take on performing, for example, as a trans woman. So, you know, I feel that with binaries, for example, gender binaries, there's always a push, there's always a tug everywhere, but each and everyone's transition or gender identity is individual to them. And that's what I'll say to that, is that, yes, it's no doubt different to how it was 50 years ago, but right now, and it goes back to what Angela was actually saying, I think the trans community does need to actually get behind one ethos, whatever that might be, because we are so broad right now when it comes to the trans movement.
Yeah.
I hope that answers that.
I'll take one more question.
Could I respond to the guy?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
The guy there raised the issue about the way in which Pride is increasingly bureaucratised and regimented. The big problem we have is the city authorities, namely the Mayor of London, Westminster City Council and the Metropolitan Police, have ganged up against Pride to impose an artificial limit of 30,000 people in the Pride Parade. So last year, 50,000 people applied to march and 20,000 were turned away. If you remember back in the 1990s, when there were no restrictions, there were over 100,000 people in the Pride Parade. On top of that, Westminster City Council, although it flies the rainbow flag and claims it's LGBT friendly, it imposes onerous charges on Pride. Charges for road closures, barricades, and Pride even has to pay for the revenue lost because of suspended parking bays. That's absolutely outrageous. You know, Westminster City Council is exploiting Pride as a money-making revenue for its own coffers. Just say on top of that, as you probably know, no individual is allowed to march in Pride today. You have to be part of an organisation, and you have to pay. The organisations have to pay. So even small underfunded groups have to pay, and you have to have a wristband, a paid-for wristband. Otherwise, you're not allowed. This is completely against the ethos of what Pride was and should be.
Well, I'm going to move on. Just this person, raise your hand.
Hiya. I'd just be interested to know when you think we're going to get our first LGBT Prime Minister.
I think you'll find you've had several.
Well, I did my bit. I mean,
let's have one more. This lady here.
I just want to make a observation. I think, is it Crispin?
Yeah.
I live in India. Okay. Section 377 came through last year, I think.
Yeah.
It didn't free 100 million Indians by any means. There's 100 million Indians that maybe won't go to jail, but things haven't changed. So I was going to come back. I've come to London about 2 weeks ago. I saw all of these beautiful Pride things, and I agree with Asifa. If I was 14 now, I would think, wow, this is amazing. But London's a very safe city. I have never ever once seen in India M&S sandwich, even though M&S are in India. I've never seen one British company with gay pride or gay, you know, positive gay things there. So, as a British company, and maybe this is to the politicians, should we be doing that worldwide? Should we be saying, okay, London's safe, maybe Birmingham's not so safe, but London's very safe. New York's safe. But what about Mumbai? What about Pakistan? What about Africa? What about these other countries? All the corporates are going in there. They're waving, like Westminster, they're waving the flag, and I almost feel like they're taking my money, but great. All these youngsters are seeing the gay pride flag if they're in London. But what about these British companies in India? So those are the things that I think, like we talked about unity before, it's about unity. I think now's the time to be unified throughout the world. That was just my observation. Thank you.
And I would completely agree with you. But remember, this is a process, it is not an event.
Yeah,
and of course, but the change in the law is, if you like, probably the most important part of that process. And if you look in the history of the UK post-Second World War, as I described, you had the laws being enforced pretty aggressively in the 1950s, but then leading to the Wolfenden Commission, which opened up the space in which the issue could be discussed. which led to the change in the law in 1967. Of course, that law has then needed almost 50 years worth of amendments to it since, in order to actually make it, to eliminate all the other little bits of inequality that were left, or lots of bits of inequality that were left within the law, including the unhappy diversion to Section 28 in the 1980s, and it was eventually repealed under the Blair government. But it is probably the most important hook, is that you are not going to go to prison for loving the person you choose to love. But of course it's part of a process, and of course all the pressure's then got to be put on Indian companies and who are now obviously vast India-based multinationals in themselves, is that those people they employ in the liberal West can demand the same treatment if they're going to go and work in India in the course of their career. And we use all the levers open to us to accelerate the process, so other nations are not going to have to take the 60, 70 years it took in the United Kingdom to move from where we were in 1950 to where we are today.
I mean, there are many things that we've got to do to help our LGBT plus brothers and sisters, sisters and brothers, whatever we want to call them, in the rest of the world. And we have to do that in any way we can through, we certainly through the Foreign Office, through all of the diplomatic pressure that we can put on, through the Commonwealth, at the UN, all of the rules-based systems. And we have to try to support as much as we can the LGBT liberation movements that are started and up and running in those places, and we need to do all we can. But we mustn't think that the reform of the law just happened in some kind of inevitable way in this country. It happened because people fought for it to happen, and we had a progressive government, Labour government, that put those laws into effect. Because through our process in the Labour Party, you've seen the film Pride, those lesbians and gay support the miners saw what was happening during the miners' strike and the oppression of the police, and they fought together against it, and the trade unions then changed the policy of the Labour Party to ensure that we supported LGBT rights. And when we had the Labour government, we put that into effect. These things don't just happen. You have to organise politically for them to happen. You have to win elections, you have to win power, and then you have to deal with the Sun and the then News of the World and the people that accused us of being a gay mafia. We had to put Section 28, we had 3 years we tried to abolish Section 28. 3 years we tried to equalise the age of consent. We couldn't get it through the House of Lords. And they spent their whole time saying, oh, they're obsessed with buggery. They don't want to do anything for anybody else. They're just obsessed with buggery because they were stopping us equalising the law. These are things that have to be fought for, and there are also things that have to be defended. Yes, London is a safer city than a lot of other cities, but it's getting less safe.
And I'm just going to take it. No, sorry, I've got to go on. I'm just going to take it on from there because the next section we're going to talk about being LGBT plus in the UK today, rights, what it's like. We're going to talk about Birmingham. We're going to talk about Northern Ireland, where I'm from, and we're going to talk about basically walking down the street and being an LGBT plus person. The first thing I want to bring up is a story I'm sure some of you saw last month of the two young women who were beaten up on the bus in Camden, not far from here. They'd been goaded and sort of jeered at by a group of men who'd seen them showing affection. They'd asked them to kiss for them, and when they hadn't, they'd attacked them until they were very bloodied, very shaken. And it was widely shared. People were very, very angry. So I suppose I'll put it to you first, Angela. Is it safe to be openly LGBT on the streets of Britain today?
In some places and not in others. You have to be very careful, I think. We had an attack in Anfield in Liverpool to gay men in their 30s who were set upon by a group of teenagers and stabbed. And the police, the youngest of those teenagers that the police have arrested, is 12 years old. We had the incidents in Southampton when two gay women were kissing on the street and they had something thrown at them from a passing car, which injured both of them. So there are signs that there is more potential threat than there has been in the past. The police are much better now than they used to be about recording hate crimes, but hate crimes have gone up have doubled in the last 4 years. So I don't think that we need to be complacent, but we do need to say that we've got to crack down on the rising tide of hate and anger and resentment and violence that we're seeing happening because of the rise of populist politics across the world.
Asifa?
I think it depends who you are and where you are. I think there is a postcode lottery in the UK, and I think that really does play in part in how safe you are. Now, you know, I know you said that London's a fairly safe city. If I were to go walking down East London, or if I were to go to like parts of Tower Hamlets or Ilford, I would feel unsafe because I know that I would be opening myself up for vulnerability. And you know, recently the statistic about trans hate crime going up 81%, for example. And if I'd like to see those figures broken down and actually see what they were in terms of trans people of colour in particular, because around the world we have seen that trans people of colour in particular are very much vulnerable.
In the US, we've
and
seen
the
some
US as well,
stories.
exactly, where I don't, you know, it depends, again, it depends where you are and who you are when it comes to your safety. Now, obviously being in and around Soho to a certain extent, I feel safe. I feel safe in central London. But like I said, if I go into parts of East London or other places, I don't feel safe. And I do know of, you know, LGBT people in rural parts of England and Wales that don't feel safe. And it is down to, I agree with Angela, I think it's down to post-Brexit Britain. I think a lot of people have given themselves permission to legitimise hate. And it's absolutely diabolical.
Yeah.
Anything, can I just say, actually as LGBT people, we've been put into the other bracket. So whether you're European, whether you're Asian or black or LGBT or Muslim, if you're not British, you're opening yourself up to hate crime. And we're going through an era now in post-Brexit Britain where it's okay. It's normalizing this kind of hate. It's what's being deemed out there. It's okay to hate. It's okay to voice our racist, our homophobic, our transphobic opinion. No, it is. Maybe you don't. Maybe you don't get it.
But I think there is.
There are people like myself and other people that get it.
I get, and you're completely right about different parts of the country. People, different groups of people will feel different levels of comfort and discomfort if they're displaying their love for others. So, and let me, this Brexit Remain point. We have become a very divided country over the Brexit Remain issue. There is no doubt about it. But there is an element in which, quite rightly, the fact of the assault on that lesbian couple on the bus was front page on every newspaper, leading the news bulletins with what happened, is a symptom of the change. And it would never have even been, might have made the local paper 20, 30 years ago. So that kind of action, there has been a sea change. And there has also, around the Brexit Remain argument, been an issue where any examples, where it could then be seen, where it seems as though Brexit supporting people have then chosen to have a punt at European Union citizens of the UK, or indeed anyone else, has had the kind of publicity which is then fueled this sense of division. And so it is not on the scale to which it is alleged, and we've got to be very important. It's very important for us, Peter said, let's proceed on the evidence about exactly what has happened, because if we're not careful, we are then going to create divisions between us that are then going to do our country serious damage. Oh, but to end, let me finish. Let me finish this.
It isn't about the evidence. What it is about is actually listening to people that are talking about it. If you're actually going to diminish people's experiences.
I'm not saying, but I'm not diminishing people's experiences. What I'm saying is that it's, and one experience is one far too many. Of course it is. But let's not suddenly presented as though there is suddenly this tidal wave of entitlement for people then to take out violence on those who are others on the back of a decision about whether or not the United Kingdom belongs to the European Union.
But it's happening.
And I realise I'm sitting in Soho in the middle of it.
So I think, but clearly there's a point that there's been a division, and there has been a sense that some people are much more likely to be.
Let me finish on a slightly lighter note, if I may. I am walking down Pimlico, hand in hand with my partner, early stage of our relationship. We've been together just over 3 years now, and a guy walks past us and he says, "Disgusting." And if you'll now forgive some soldierly language, my instant reaction was, "F off, you homophobic." I can't tell you how impressed my partner was.
Yeah, and I can't tell you how much I have to apologise for everyone who's watching this on the live stream. I'll just finally pass this to you, Peter. Do you have any thoughts on this? I'm sure you do.
Everybody's made good points, so I'll leave it.
We'll move on. Yeah.
And can I just make a point on this thing about unity? I don't care who threw the first stone, okay? Whether it was a white cisgendered gay man or a trans person of colour. I guess for me what's important is actually not erasing or getting the voices of people of colour heard, actually across the spectrum, because as a minority, within a minority, I feel my voice isn't heard in the majority of cases.
I think what was interesting about that exchange, and we won't dwell on it any longer, but I think everyone wants to get to the origins of those stories. They want to get to the truth of it, and I think that's what's changed. The thing I want to move on to next is Birmingham. I'm sure most people have been following this in the news. It's a No Outsiders program. It's teaching primary school children about the existence of gay people and trans people. It's teaching them about same-sex parents. And we've seen that protest at that school, a largely Muslim school, parents taking their children out of protest. It's somewhat ongoing, and people are seeing it as an assault on LGBT people's existence and the fact that we're being sort of blocked out from the view of children. Angela, you spoke quite passionately about this in the House of Commons. You said that we're not going back in the closet.
We're not, are we?
No.
Good. I think that these protests are part of an organised backlash to shove us back in the closet. And we must not, and the government must not, allow it to happen. It's being well organised. It tells complete lies about what is contained in the No Outsiders curriculum itself. So to that extent it's malicious, and it's spreading falsehoods, and it's winding people up in order to try to present a community as if it's represented by one of the more fundamentalist parts of that particular religion. Which is why it's really important that moderate Muslim voices calling it out are properly heard. And this is being done in advance of the introduction of the RSE, the Relationship and Sex Education curriculum, which will be introduced next year.
It's been a long time coming, hasn't it?
It's been far too long coming, and it's far too modest in the way in which it's being introduced, although I understand why that might be the case. But even so, it's being organised against, and so this will not go away. It needs to be dealt with very firmly, and we need to exert our values as a liberal democracy, and that is Parliament has decided overwhelmingly to introduce relationship and sex education into schools, age appropriate, thank goodness, which is inclusive of LGBT people and others. And we are going to see that introduced up and down this country so we can teach our kids respect and teach them about diversity.
Peter, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because some people will always say parents know best, and that's the argument that comes from their side. How do you feel about this?
Well, the surveys of parents themselves show that the majority of parents in this country don't feel comfortable or competent in talking to their children about these issues. And overwhelmingly, parents say they do think schools should be addressing these matters.
I just want to
so
jump in there,
most parents...
There was a poll yesterday from ITV News which showed that 59% of people backed LGBT relationships in schools. Only 25% said no, 16% unsure. So overwhelmingly, people want it.
But the bigger issue, I think, that we mustn't duck away from is that the protests in Birmingham are being supported by a segment of the Muslim population in those areas and are being orchestrated by extremists within those communities. And some people want to shy away from the Muslim issue because they think it's going to create problems. My foundation has always taken the view that we have to confront religious homophobia, biphobia and transphobia from whichever faith it comes from. And we've done plenty against the Church of England, the Catholic Church, Jewish fundamentalists and so on. But we believe that the way to focus this issue is by trying to create solidarity between the Muslim and LGBT community. Yeah. So for the last few years we've been running what we call an LGBT Muslim solidarity campaign. And our basic message is that both the Muslim community and the LGBT plus community know the pain of discrimination and hate crime. That we know what it's like to be outsiders, to be demonized, to be scapegoated, to be victims. And that therefore, despite whatever differences we have a common interest in working together. And that we can and should work together. And so, for example, some years ago, in fact, quite a few years ago, you may know that the Muslim Council of Britain, which is the main, or says it's the main representative body of Muslims in this country, representing about 400 plus Muslim organizations, from its inception in the 1990s, joined with Christian and Jewish fundamentalists to oppose every gay law reform. So I, on a number of occasions, wrote to the General Secretary appealing for solidarity and standing together against all hate. We never got a response. But then I engineered for the media and public affairs spokesperson to be invited on a panel about a non-LGBT issue, where I was going to be, and for us to have dinner together afterwards. And I put it to him that I accepted that it was very unlikely the Muslim Council would ever be able to endorse homosexuality. But perhaps could the Muslim Council make a distinction between what they personally believed and what the law of the land says? That they can still, albeit sadly, hold the view that homosexuality is sinful and wrong, but they should not demand the law impose their particular view on the rest of society. And that person was Inayat Bughanwala. And then I engineered another meeting with the legal affairs spokesperson, Abdurrahman Jafar, to also meet me, and he also agreed to adopt this position. And together, they took these arguments to the Muslim Council. And as a result, the Muslim Council in 2007 took a decision when the legislation outlawing discrimination goods and services was going through Parliament to not support the protests, and they made a public statement saying they did not want to be associated with a homophobic campaign and did not support discrimination. And that position lasted for another 4 years until there was a change in the leadership, and then sadly, when same-sex marriage came in the agenda, the new leadership reverted. But even despite that, that campaign showed the possibility of building alliances and changing hearts and minds. So I think that is the way we need to go. We need to have a dialogue with Muslim communities and organizations to emphasize the common interest in fighting all hate.
Okay, and Asifa, how do you feel about this?
I would say, look, put the LGBT and queer Muslims forward in this argument and in this debate. We hold the key here. You know, in the green room I was saying that there are times when I feel that I have to fight racism and Islamophobia within the LGBT community, and within the Muslim community I have to fight homophobia and transphobia. And the key to this is very much put LGBT Muslims forward, have our voices heard. And what the good thing I feel that's come out of Birmingham is there has been a rise of LGBT Muslims and queer Muslims actually speaking out on national media, protesting outside the school, talking to parents, and that very much is the key. Secondly, I firmly believe that the majority of the British Muslim population is progressive and moderate and liberal. However, the minority of right-wing extremist views in the country get the column inches, they get the attention, and the liberal Muslim wing always remains silent. And that's where the key is please let's turn up the volume on the liberal Muslim voice and the LGBT Muslim voice, because, you know, as we have two communities that are being pitted against each other, and literally it's only the people in the middle, who are people like myself, that can have those dialogues with both communities in order to bring them together, because there's much more commonality than there is difference right now, especially with what we're going through in Britain right now.
And the final thing I wanted to say about equality nationwide is we still don't have same-sex marriage in Northern Ireland, and arguably one of the reasons of that is because the DUP oppose it. Currently the government, or certainly Westminster, could push through legislation as they have done in the past, but they are not doing that. And so Crispin, I put it to you, is that to keep the DUP happy? Are the Conservatives keeping the DUP sweet by not introducing same-sex marriage in Northern Ireland?
I don't think it's quite as simple as that. There's plainly a majority, a very substantial majority in Parliament for same-sex marriage in the whole of the United Kingdom in Northern Ireland. Is the government holding its hand back on this because of the DUP vote? Or is it actually trying to respect the constitutional settlement of Northern Ireland, that this is an issue for the politicians elected in Northern Ireland? And there is, of course, the pressure mounts. The longer Stormont is not sitting, the greater the pressure goes to override the constitutional settlement and actually say that our fellow Northern Ireland citizens deserve the same rights as everyone else in the United Kingdom. Exactly when that point is very nearly being reached now.
Well, I will point out that when we got civil partnerships in Northern Ireland, that was pushed through by Westminster when there was no sitting government at Stormont, and that was 2 years in. We're now about 2.5 years in, so I think it's time. But there we go. On any of those, do you want to
watch this space?
Yes.
There's a plan. Any questions on what we've just discussed from the audience? Let's get them in. This gent at the front here.
Hi. I was going to ask a fairly lengthy question about sort of different social spheres and sort of out people in showbiz and in politics and whatnot, but the place that we really lack it is in sport, which is, I think, a place where if you saw an out cricketer in India, if you saw out rugby players, out football players, you actually might see the tide turn a hell of a lot quicker. However, the question I am going to ask, because I don't want to rant for ages, is the point about the media. And the question is do you think the media is hindering or advancing the progression of LGBT rights around the globe?
Anyone feel strongly about that one? Around the globe, you say around the globe?
I mean, if you want to take the UK first and then look elsewhere, then fine.
Let's take the UK first. So
you see where I'm coming from.
Yeah, Angela, you mentioned earlier on about having to battle the Sun in the News of the World back in the day. How has the media landscape changed in terms of what you're up against when you're looking at progressive issues?
Well, I think that they have had to move with the times, and so they're not behaving in quite the same way as they did in the 80s now, and because they know their readership wouldn't support it.
Well, some people say trans people are demonized.
I was just about to come on to say, I think that if you read quite a lot of the coverage around trans people and trans issues, it reminds me of the coverage we had in the 1980s about LGBT people. It's just as hysterical, mostly not based on fact, and incites, I wouldn't say directly violence, but it certainly others and dehumanises trans people, and it has to be confronted. in terms of your comment on sport, again, I feel very much as a young 8-year-old who went to her first chess tournament and found I was the only girl playing, and my first opponent told me that girls didn't play chess. So I beat him, and then when I won the tournament and I was given a Biggles book for a prize, I realised that the organisers didn't think girls played chess either. So I understand your question about your issue with sport, and having sport be part of the transformation for women's rights, for LGBT people, does make enormous strides. But you're asking individuals who are often individual sports stars or people in football teams to carry an awful lot of weight and pressure in an environment where they've got to get endorsements, where they have to run out on a field with 50,000 chanting people. It's asking an awful lot. So we need to provide as supportive an environment as possible. And clearly, you know, there are beginning to be sports stars that are LGBT. Thank goodness.
One more question. Yourself there in the white shirt.
Thanks everyone for a really amazing panel discussion. It's a big honour to be here tonight. I had a question to do with identity politics on the back of what was mentioned about when social movements first started, the different groups work together. To what extent is identity politics a force for good or bad? And I can go to anyone.
I would say that identity politics is a reaction to exclusion. You know, in the bad old days, women, black and ethnic minority people, religious minorities, LGBT plus people, we were not part of the national conversation and agenda. And in response to that exclusion, we had to organise ourselves. We had to defend our own space, our own identity, our own being. So that's why identity politics came into being, and I think it's been, on the whole, mostly very progressive. It's uplifted marginalised communities. But there is a strand of identity politics which is very much in its own silo, that it's separate, distinct, mono-focused, and neglects others in a similar position. And I think we must always bear in mind, when we fight our own corner, our common humanity. The fact that we are not the only ones who are disadvantaged or marginalised, that there are others in a similar position, and that working together collectively for our common good is the way forward, because unity is strength. Yeah. Together we are stronger. When we fight our separate battles, we are weaker. So in contrast to many people in the LGBT plus movement, I've always argued that it's best not to fight exclusively LGBT plus battles. It's best to situate the LGBT fight within the broader context of human rights. So I was never really in favour of specific gay rights legislation. I argued back in the 70s that we needed a comprehensive Anti-Discrimination Act to protect all communities. So that way we would unite women, black and ethnic minority people, religious minorities, elderly people, single mothers, and LGBT plus people. We could all work together to have a comprehensive Equal Rights Act that would protect us all. Now, in the end, we got it with the Equality Act in 2010, but it was a long time coming. And I think if we had fought that battle earlier on, we might have got that result sooner. So I think there's a big advantage in us working with other communities. And I suppose relationship with sex education is a very good example. Of course we want LGBT plus inclusive relationship and sex education in schools. But I think we also want better quality relationship and sex education for all young kids, whatever their sexuality or gender identity. And that way we create a unity of solidarity between LGBT plus people and straight people. And then we are stronger, we're more united, we're more effective.
Now, we're running very short on time, so the final section we were going to talk about LGBT plus rights around the world. We've already touched on it quite a bit, so I'm just going to sort of try and boil that discussion down as best as I can. And I wanted to use the situation of, I mean, look, we've got LGBT people in countries all over the world. Some of them are facing imprisonment, even the death penalty, if they're you know, being sexually active or being out about their gender or sexual identity. My question is, how do we help them out? What can we do? Crispin?
Well, my work after I left the government in 2012, and trying to decide what should my agenda, personal agenda in politics be, was then really dictated by the fact that I had come out in 2010 and I had been able to come out into an environment where it was, in terms of my political career, entirely safe for me to do so. And I had made absolutely no contribution whatsoever to the delivery of that freedom. And so the conclusion that I came to was that what I ought to be doing was then trying to repay my debt to the British people who had opened up that freedom for me here by supporting the equivalent campaigners in the United Kingdom in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s who created the freedom for me by working to support them. And so I was asked by Lance Price, who was then the Chief Executive of the Kaleidoscope Trust, which is a fantastic organisation which I would think we should all be involved in supporting, which supports LGBT activists in those jurisdictions, particularly in much of the Commonwealth, who've inherited these British laws, trying to improve the situation in those countries. And of course they are under a level of discrimination that goes from a degree of neglect to serious to very serious difficulties in those countries. And that then got changed into, we moved that on into an all-party parliamentary group. And but what I was able to do was to go and on visits to other countries and look at my parliamentary colleagues in the eye from those other countries in parliamentary conferences, not least the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association Conference, and tell them, you represent just as many gay people as I do. And you have a duty to them just as much as you have a duty to the rest of the people you represent. And to get them through my story to an understanding that is the case across the entire world, and it is not a matter of choice. And I was a person who used that term in the House of Commons, about choice around sexuality, because I did not understand even myself. So to get parliamentary colleagues then to begin to think about about the issue that in terms of that it's not a choice, I think it begins to open up all of issues that then fall as their responsibility then to follow up from that position.
But looking at something like Brunei, for example, so in May they threatened to introduce the death penalty, and a month later they kind of said, actually, we're not going to do that anymore. What was the big difference there was a boycott it was a business boycott, really. It was more of an economic thing. Would you agree?
I think it was that, but it was also through diplomatic channels. I mean, it went down very, very badly indeed. And I think the important thing from those countries that have managed to make progressive change and the big economies is that they have to not turn a blind eye to that kind of regression of behaviour. What we want to do is get rid of the death penalty for LGBT people across the world and actually try and support positive reform for everybody so that we can spread LGBT rights globally. And we've got to do that using our soft power as a country, our diplomatic power. And if there are corporations that can do it, and the UN and the rest of it, that's all equally important. You've got to bring as much pressure to bear, be it economic or diplomatic or soft power.
Can I just amplify or agree with what Angela just said? But I would also refer to what Asifa said earlier. We can use leverage internationally, but not just Britain, the whole international community. But what Asifa said, which is absolutely right, is we must amplify the voices and the struggles of the people in these countries who are leading this fight, who know the issues on the ground, and whose voices need to be heard. If we can give them a platform, then that is so, so important. It's, among other things, it's just an emotional and psychological boost that they feel they're being listened to and that they can speak for themselves.
And through the work of the Kaleidoscope Trust, then enable me to again meet the activists on the ground in these countries, and then make the links quietly to their parliamentary representatives, who can't meet them in public because of the climate in society. But if you can begin to make those engagements, then you are beginning the process and contributing to the process.
And the
of
last
change.
word to you, Asifa.
I know we're talking about global matters here, but can we also get our own LGBT asylum process in this country sorted out first?
Fair enough.
Because the amount of clubbers that come to my LGBT Bollywood clubs that cry their eyes out saying they are scared of being deported because the British government doesn't believe they look gay enough is just ridiculous. And the amount of ridiculous hurdles they have to go through to prove that they're LGBT is absolutely disgusting. So can we get that sorted?
I would just point out that in a report in November, the number of LGBT plus asylum seekers refused by the Home Office had risen by 52%. I think that was year on year at that point. So anyway, before we finish up for the night, I'll take some final questions from the audience. Yourself in the stripy shirt.
Sure.
Just wait till we get the mic to you there.
Hi, I hope you don't mind me very briefly going back to the UK. Is that all right?
Sure, yeah, any points? Fine.
So at the start of the talk, Christopher said that equality is something enshrined in the establishment. Now, our next Prime Minister is going to be Boris Johnson, someone who speaks up for minorities when he's trying to become the Mayor of London and then bashes them in his Daily Telegraph column. Is he someone who is more likely to have a trans woman in his cabinet or more likely to be overheard joking about trans women?
The joy of Boris, probably both. I mean, if you ask me, I'm trying to give you an honest answer. He will say careless things because he's trying to be amusing and everything else, without thinking through the consequences of what he's saying, and that's what happens if you dash off newspaper columns which come in about.
Do you think we should let him get away with that when he's Prime Minister?
Well, he's not getting away with it now. I mean, he's being held to account. And he is getting a serious examination, as he properly should, about the things that he's written and he said, and you know about them, and everybody here knows about them. But
he's getting a very hard time, but it's not damaging.
No, but because the Boris Johnson I know in person is actually essentially a social liberal who is entirely comfortable with London as it is, which is the presentation he gave as mayor of London. He would be utterly proud at wanting to support and did as Mayor of London.
Can I just say that I think that when you're an old Etonian Bullingdon boy and you're taking the mickey out of bum boys, excuse the language,
and Muslim women,
pickaninnies and letterbox, comparing Muslim women to letterboxes, it's not prime ministerial, it's bullying, and it's not, as he was saying, ironic, it's reprehensible.
Amen.
Next question. Yourself, yeah. Actually, sorry, you've already asked one, so can we just get that chap behind you there with the microphone? Sorry, I'm trying to be fair here.
Can I just quickly say, actually, bring it on. I'm so looking forward to Boris Johnson being our next Prime Minister. I really hope a general election comes, because he's going to be totally wiped off the face of the earth.
So can I just ask?
I can't hear you very well. Is that on? Yeah.
Can I just ask that we talk about India and we talk about Brunei, but there are countries in Europe where same-sex marriage isn't recognised. For example, I'm a Scotsman who was married in Scotland, married to a Romanian, and our marriage isn't recognised. What do we do about that? I know it's a bit up in the air, but
I think it kind of goes back to what we've already discussed, to be honest, in terms of the diplomacy and what Angela was pointing out and the work that you were pointing out with Clayton. I think it all falls into that.
But I think it's also the argument that they're controlled by the church, and we have a parliamentary system that does work and maybe doesn't work.
Yeah.
Can I make a point about the church?
No, I'm going to move on. Sorry. One last question, and it's to this chap in the front row, and that's the final thing.
I wanted to thank you all for taking the time this evening, because I think we've all learned something. But my question to you individually is, what is your ask from tonight? What would you want? What's the pledge you want us to make from tonight? What would we do differently over this Pride weekend?
One quick point each. Let's start with you, Crispin. I'll move this way.
Support the Kaleidoscope Trust and its work, because the challenge overseas is so very much greater than here, even though the challenge here remains to some degree.
Asifa?
We are the most diverse community in Britain. Please amplify the voices within the community that are not heard.
Angela?
Keep organised and don't be complacent.
Peter?
Take nothing for granted. Berlin in 1930 was the queer capital of the world. And yet 3 years later, the Nazis came to power, gay clubs and bars were shut down, and the first gay and bisexual men were carted off to concentration camps. Now, I can't imagine right now that happening here or in Europe in the foreseeable future. But who can tell what might happen in 20, 30 or 40 years' time? The price of freedom is eternal vigilance.
I just want to thank all of you for coming. It's been such a lovely night. It's been a great little space, great little discussion. And one more time to thank Peter Tatchell, Angela Eagle, Asifa Lahore, and Crispin Blunt.